today Professor Adriana Valio from Universidade Mackenzie. Adriana has her bachelor from the Universidade Estadual de Campinas. His master degree is here by the Universidade de São Paulo, and her PhD is from University of California at Berkeley. She realized postdocs at Caltech and the Unicamp. She's a livre docente. She's a professor here at the University of São Paulo in livre docente. She was president of the Brazilian Astronomical Society, member of the directorship of SAB several times. She works at the CRAM, Centro de Radioastronomia e Astrofísica Mackenzie, where she's a titular professor since 2016. She's member of the CNPq Committee in Physics and Astronomy. She was, no? Mm-hmm. And currently she coordinates the work package 123.6 on stellar rotation from transits of satellite plateau that will fly in the next few years, I hope. Next year? Perfect. Nice to have you here, Adriana. She will talk about Estrelas Active stars and exoplanets. Space climate beyond the solar system.
Okay. Thank you very much, Laerte, for the introduction, and I would also like to thank for the invitation to give a talk here at my alma mater, Universidade de São Paulo, UIAG. English? Do I continue in English? Yes? Okay. So, well, this is the title. The slides are in Portuguese if anyone has any difficulties. Okay, so as an introduction, I have expanded the concept of space weather, which is Clima Espacial, to other stars and other planetary systems. And this has expanded also the concept of habitability, of planet habitability, because it's not only the temperature which will determine if the planet has or not liquid water on the surface, but also all the activity of the star will certainly impact the planets, especially those which are very close to their host stars. So ultraviolet radiation from flares, coronal mass ejections, stellar wind, and so forth, so on and so forth. And of course, this might make a hostile environment around on these planets. And so what I'll talk about is the interactions between the stars and their planets. So what is space weather? So space weather are the phenomena of stellar activity which impact the planets around, just like the sun impacts our planet Earth. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few slides. And this includes all the production of radiation and energetic particles from the stars. And of course, this will affect not only the atmospheres of the planet, but also their magnetospheres and surfaces as well. So here on Earth, what are the impacts or the effects of the solar activity on our planets? And this you probably may be more familiar with, and you probably heard it in the news, you know, when strong events from the sun like flares and coronal mass ejections, especially the coronal mass ejections, when all these energetic particles and plasma, when they reach our planet, of course not all of them will reach our planet, but when the ones that do, they can affect, they can cause alterations in the orbits of satellites, including, like the downfall, the premature downfall of these satellites, geomagnetic storms, alterations in the ionosphere, which will affect long-distance communication of low frequency waves, power grids, like blackout and electric currents in power grids. Of course, erratic behavior of navigation instruments like GPS and compasses, alterations of the ozone layer, and of course, the nice and beautiful auroras. That's what the CMEs will cause. CMEs are short for coronal mass ejections. The flares may cause, like lethal dosage of UV and X radiation to astronauts which are not protected, which are not inside the International Space Station. So where does all this activity come from? It comes from the magnetic field of the star. And so it has like intense magnetic fields. And so in those regions, that's where the magnetic reconnection will occur. And that's what will produce the flares and the coronal mass ejections. And we can say that like manifestations of this activity are spots, flares, and coronal mass ejections. And to understand the activity of the stars is especially important for M dwarfs. Why? Because the habitable zone, I'll define what is a habitable zone later on, but it's much closer to the star. So that means that you might have a terrestrial planet close to the M star, but will suffer a lot of all this radiation and energetic particles. And well, of course, the origin of the magnetic field is the rotation of the star, which generates a dynamo in the bottom of the convective zone. And we can use the sun as a natural laboratory to study all this, because that's the star where we have the highest resolution, spatial resolution, spectral resolution, and temporal resolution. And we know that the sun, there is a pattern of activity, like periodic activity, which varies every 11 years. Right now, we are at solar maximum. So if anybody wants to catch an aurora, now is the time. Then the solar activity will start to decrease for the next years. And then you have to wait another 11 years to be in a solar maximum again. And of course, when there is a solar maximum, the sun has more exhibits more spots, produces more flares, and more coronal mass ejections. And we use then all this, what we learned from studying the sun and the flares and coronal mass ejections on the sun, we use this to create models which we can apply to other stars, and then try to make forecasts of what's going to happen there and how their planets, their orbiting planets are going to be affected by all this activity. And for that, my team and myself, we have used data from space missions such as the Kepler mission, which was launched in 2009, and the TESS mission, which is, the Kepler mission, which detected flares and thousands of exoplanets, is not working anymore. But now we have its successor, which is the TESS mission, which basically does the same kind of observations, monitoring, looking for for stars, bright small stars near the solar system. And of course, with that data, we can not only search for exoplanets, but we can also probe the stellar activity of the host stars. And just to give you an example, here is the product of these telescopes. Here is the light curve of Kepler-17. So here's the flux, which is detected, like the brightness of the star as a function of days. And these vertical lines here are the transits of the hot Jupiter Kepler 17b. But what you can see is that the brightness of the star varies. There's minimums and maximums, and this occurs just because there are spots, dark spots on the surface of the star. And these spots, then when there's a lot of spots on the surface of the star, the brightness decreases, and when there are few spots on the surface of the star, the brightness increases. And so what do we know? And this is until last week when I prepared this presentation. There are more than almost 6,000 exoplanets confirmed so far, and they are there's a complete zoo of exoplanets, you know, like different kinds, like giant planets like Jupiter, hot Jupiters, which are like Jupiter but very close to their stars. There are, of course, Neptunes and sub-Neptunes, super-Earth, and terrestrial planets. And I'd just like to point out that sub-Neptunes and super-Earth, which are the most abundant planets in our galaxy, we do not have any counterpart on the solar system. And those are planets with intermediate mass and radius between a terrestrial planet like Earth and a giant planet, gaseous planet like Jupiter. And for all these planets, we have more than 360 planets and candidates in the habitable zone, which they are, and you know, their equilibrium temperature or their theoretical temperature will be something between 180 Kelvin and 310 Kelvin, where there could exist liquid water on their surface, and the insolation, which is the amount of radiation that they receive from their star, is between 1/4 and 2.2 times what Earth receives, the insolation that Earth receives from the sun. And from this over 5,900 planets, almost 1,000 are planetary systems, that is, a star with more than one planet orbiting it. And here is a slide from University of Arecibo. And well, here are the solar system planets, just in size. You know, the sizes are in scale. So Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Neptune. And here are the 22 planets which are potentially habitable planets. And you can compare them with the size of the Earth. Some of them are super Earth, like these ones, which are slightly larger. But most of them are the size of Earth, and they are within the habitable zone of their star. And here's Proxima Centauri b, which is the closest exoplanet in a habitable zone, and it is terrestrial, 4.2 light years from us. And then there are the TRAPPIST planets, which I'm going to talk about towards the end of my presentation. And these are just 22, but we have many more. So what is the habitable zone? So let's talk a little bit about what is the habitable zone. It is this region here, the green region, you know, like around the star, where water, if there is water, it will be in a liquid form around, you need a little bit of coordination here, around the star to be liquid. Okay, and what you can see is that in this figure here, this distance of the habitable zone varies with the mass or brightness of the star. So cooler stars like M dwarfs, the habitable zone will be much closer in, and then brighter stars, hotter stars, the habitable zone will be further out. And that's the thing that I already pointed out, is that for M dwarfs, the habitable zone is too close to the star. And M dwarfs are very active, especially the fully convective stars. So they have a lot of flares and probably a lot of CMEs as well, coronal mass ejections. And so this is probably harmful for any kind of life that is being either originating or developed on the surface of a terrestrial planet in the habitable zone of an M dwarf. Not to talk about all the, and I'm going to say a little bit more about this, of atmospheric erosion. So the winds also from the star and the photoevaporation can just wipe out the atmosphere of these planets. And of course, magnetic field. That's the protection necessary against energetic particles. And of course, an atmosphere, thick atmosphere, to also protect against the radiation. Of course, the ozone does that for Earth, but the ozone is here because there's life here, right? And so, talking a little bit about the interaction between the star and their planet, the important factors, and these are especially important for short orbits, that is, closing planets with orbital periods, that is, the year of the planet is less than 10 days, or like a complete orbit around the star. And of course, these planets will have the most interaction, both gravitational, from tides, gravitational tides, and also from magnetic interaction. And the magnetic interaction can generate electrical currents and auroras, just like in Jupiter. And here, also like the tides, gravitational tides, like for the system Io Jupiter. And so this is what it's illustrated here in this picture. So here's Io, and then there is this connection with the planet. And there's also a torus of sulfur ions or here around Jupiter, caused by all the volcanoes that are spewing, like sulfur atoms and other molecules and other atoms, like from Io. And of course, this can also affect, for some planets, if you have like a hot Jupiter very close to the star, then there's probably a magnetic interaction between the planet and its star. And so the presence of a magnetized planet in close orbit may influence the activity of the star. So there are some examples where we can see that the spots occur with a periodicity which is equal to the orbital period of the planet. And what is the space weather then on these exoplanets? What can all this activity of the star, what impacts will it have on the exoplanet? First, atmospheric erosion. So stellar wind, intense radiation from the star will remove gases from the planet, just like in this illustration here. The UV radiation can induce photoevaporation of the top layers of the planetary atmospheres. Flares and CMEs can also cause loss of atmosphere, chemical erosion, and electric current induction. And again, what are some of the factors that can protect this planet? Orbital distance. Of course, the further away the planet is from the star, the safer it is, the less hostile its environment is going to be. The magnetic field, which will shelter the planet from energetic particles, and of course the atmospheric composition, which can filter all this radiation. So the erosion, here are like some mechanisms for the erosion of the planetary atmosphere. Thermal escape or GEANS mechanism, hydrodynamical escape, which is much more massive escape than the thermal escape. Here from basically the stellar wind, photoevaporation from the UV and X-ray radiation from the star, and coronal mass ejections can also erode the atmosphere. And here's just an example of what happens. What is the photoevaporation? We have the UV radiation coming from the star, which will heat, like especially the top layers of the atmosphere. And then these particles will gain velocity, will gain energy, will gain velocity, and then they can escape the gravitational attraction of the star. And especially mini Neptunes and super Earth are affected by photoevaporation. And here is just an example of a photoevaporation, and this has been observed. So here's the star, here's a transiting planet, and then here is its atmosphere. And what was shown is that this is the optical transit of this. I see it this way. So this is the optical transit of the star. What we would see in the optical, which just with respect to this brown circle here. But because there is an expanded atmosphere which is being evaporated, and this atmosphere we can probe in ultraviolet using the Lyman alpha line. And what we see is that the transit observed through a telescope, UV, observing in the UV, it's much deeper than the optical transit. What does that mean? The depth of the transit is proportional to the area of the planet to the area of the star. So that means that the ultraviolet emitting atmosphere, it's much larger in size than the planet itself. So, and not only that, but this asymmetry also shows that this is not spherical, but it's tail-like. It has a tail, which is due just to the photoevaporation of the atmosphere. Okay, so now going into the stellar activity, spots. So this is a photograph of a solar active regions with lots of sunspots with umbra and penumbra. And this is just a AI-made image of what a star, an active star will look like with lots of spots on its surface. And what we know is that young stars, like here is like a 50 million years old star, will rotate faster, have much more magnetic activity, and much larger spots on its surface. And then the area covered by spots will decrease as the stars get older. So here's a 2 billion years old star, and here's a 5 billion year old star like our sun. And what you can see here is this periodicity here is due to the rotation of the star, or star with spots as it rotates. Remember, the brightness increases and decreases depending on the amount of spots, the number of spots that we're seeing on the visible hemisphere of the star. So the amplitude decreases as the star ages, and the period also increases as the star becomes older, because the dynamo is related to the rotation of the star. How can we detect the star spots? So there are basically 3 ways to have information about the spots, the star spots. Doppler imaging, using spectroscopy. The photometric modulation, like this is for Corot 2, and so here are the transits. But what you're seeing here is the modulation of the spots on the surface of the star, and we can do this using photometry from data from Corot, from Kepler, from TESS. And then the method that I invented, oh boy, more than 20 years ago, okay, which is, well, if there's a transiting planet and the planet passes in front of the star, it will create a signature that we can, like so. So here is a spot on the surface of the star. The transiting planet can occult. Of course, it's a coincidence that it passes right in front of the spot. But what we see is a small increase in the brightness here, just because the brightness here of the spot is less than the surrounding brightness of the star. So we see this bump here. And this is what signal we would see. Here are true images of the sun. And here is a Jupiter-sized planet transit. And you can even see, because it's so small, this is for an Earth-sized planet here. And what you can see is this bump. And then in the case of an Earth-sized planet, you can see a relatively large bump. And not only that, but also structure from these active regions, which has more than one spot. But don't be fooled here. This is like a little bit over 1%. And this is, see, 0.00001. Okay, so it's like 1/100th of a percent, which is what is written here. And so I created this model, which is called Eclipse. and it does just like that, a 2D pixel image of the sun. You can put as many spots and you can distribute it wherever. And then a planet, which is a dark disk of a certain radius, which is a fraction of the stellar radius. And I know in transit, we use the same major axis, the period, and the inclination of the orbit. So these are the orbital parameters. We make it transit, and then we can detect these signatures. Once we do that, we model it, the spot, the star spot, by intensity, radius, and its position, latitude and longitude, on the surface of the star. And this code is freely available in Python at this GitHub here. And this has been applied for, oh, I'm sorry, something happened here, to already 15 stars of different spectral types, solar type, and M stars. And once we know what the parameters of the spots are, intensity and radius, we can estimate a flux deficit, which is how much flux the spot is subtracting from the stellar surface. And once we know, and this is a study that we did for a full solar cycle, 11 years of solar images, an image of taken every day, and using computer vision, a former master student of mine mapped over 32,000 spots. And then we got relations between the magnetic, because for the sun we also have magnetograms, so we know what the magnetic intensity of the spots are. So I think I forgot to mention this, but like a spot is a dark region on the surface of the sun or the stars, and it's darker because it's cooler, and it's cooler because the magnetic field is more intense than the rest. It's usually in the hundreds and thousands of Gauss, while the rest of the surface of the sun is basically 10 Gauss. But there is a linear relation for the sun, which relates the magnetic field and the flux deficit. But we can apply this, since we measure the radius of the spot or area and the intensity of the spot, then we can estimate its magnetic field. Oh, I forgot to put the reference here, but this was an APJ letter that we published last year. And so for 14 stars, this is what the histograms of what the magnetic field of star spots look like. And you can see that they're of the order between 3,000 and 4,000 Gauss here. So those are basically, of course, these are stronger than the sun. The sun, the average magnetic field is around 1,500, 1,500. So these are a little bit stronger, but okay, these are stars which rotate. I think the maximum rotation period here is maybe 15 days. So these are stars which are younger than the sun, and probably and these spots are also much larger than what we see on the sun. And so the magnetic fields are also twice or even more, twice or 3 times the magnetic field of sunspots. And super flares. So TESS was a big discoverer of super flares. Of course, they were known before, but like with TESS, we can do like large numbers and statistics of what are super flares. So the Japanese group led by Maehara studied almost 10,000 stars, solar type stars, and found 365 super flares. What is a super flare? The sun, the energy of a flare goes from 10 to the 27 to at most 10 to the 32 ergs, okay? But for these stars, the energy can go to 1,000 times, sometimes 10,000 times more energetic than in the sun. And what you can see here is the light curve of the star, which goes up and down because there are spots on their surface. And then suddenly here you have these peaks, or like here is a large flare, which lasts for a few minutes, couple of hours at most. So here a comparison between stellar flares and solar flares. So in the sun, the flare will last about minutes, and here's the energy that I already said, and it will cause geomagnetic storms when it reaches the Earth. And super flares on M dwarfs can last from minutes to hours. They can be 10 to 10,000 times more energetic than solar, and they can cause completely sterilize the surface of a planet around it. Doesn't matter if it's in the habitable zone or not. And of course, there's the problem of recurrent flares and the cumulative effect, which may affect the prebiotic chemistry on these planets. Coronal mass ejections are usually associated with flares. One is not the cause of the other, but when they're big, they usually come together. So the magnetic field of the sun reconnects itself and produces both events. And so you can see here, this is a coronagraph on the SOHO satellite. This is the disk of the sun, and here is the coronagraph, which blocks the light of the sun, so that we can see these beautiful coronal mass ejections. And the coronal mass ejections, they usually have velocities ranging on the sun from about 200 kilometers per second to up to 3,000 kilometers per second. And there are, when magnetized plasma wrapped up in magnetic fields are expelled from the corona, from the atmosphere of the sun. Okay? In other stars, it's very hard to detect because what we're seeing here is a scattered light from the photosphere of the sun. So of course, if we can't block the starlight so close to the disk, so it's very hard. We haven't detected any of coronal mass ejections like with this visually like this with an image. And of course, the space weather impact would be magnetic storms on exoplanets. And here is, but okay, we can't image a coronal mass ejection directly, but we can see its signature on H-alpha line. So here is an H-alpha line observation spectra of V374 PEG. And what you see here are emissions predominantly on the blue wing, which means that material is being hydrogen, right? It's hydrogen. It's being ejected from the surface or from the corona of the star. And so these are signatures of coronal mass ejections from this star on the blue wing of H-alpha observations. And and this image, this is a beautiful image. This is aurora on Jupiter. Okay, so what we're seeing here is aurora caused by a coronal mass ejection from the sun when it hit Jupiter. So magnetic field, planetary magnetic field can act as a shield to charged particles, and they will deviate the charged particles, which might come into the atmosphere of the planet through the poles or high latitudes. And so how can we detect magnetic fields in exoplanets? Well, we can see asymmetric absorption in UV transits, radio emission from the planets, because these auroras will also cause very low frequency radiation from the planets, because the frequency here is proportional to 2.8. This is the synchrotron frequency B, and that will be in megahertz. And there are some observatories, the LOFAR, the GMRT, and the future SKA. A modulation of stellar activity, because hot Jupiters can induce the variability on chromospheric lines like calcium 2, H, and K. And what we have to look for are synchronized signatures of stellar activity, which are synchronized with the orbital period. Then we know that that stellar activity was induced by a magnetic field of the planet. And a researcher which is very active in this field is Aline Vidotto, which most of you might know, who was a former student here of IAG as well. And this is an observation. She's a co-author of this paper. And what you see here are, again, transits observed in the optical and in the UV. And this is the data from Hubble. Okay, these are Hubble data, the crosses here. And what you can see is that the optical transit does not fit the data at all. What we have to, which means that the UV emission, it's coming from further out than the planet. And so this is their model. So what they think they're measuring, what they claim they're measuring here, is the bow shock from the magnetosphere of this hot Jupiter here, which is WASP 12b. Okay, astrobiology and stellar activity. So we've seen all the harmful effects. I mean, I've talked about all the harmful effects of all the stellar activity, especially the UV light, the UV radiation from the star, which can be lethal to living organisms, which can cause atmospheric erosion, and climate instability, but they can also be beneficial. They can induce prebiotic chemical reactions, just like on Earth. I think most of you learned in school about the Miller-Urey experiment. Well, they put, like a bowl with soup, organic soup, and then put electric currents, which simulated lightning, and got the production of simple organic molecules. And so the activity, the stellar activity of a young star might counteract the fact that the star is also dimmer. The sun was like 70% less bright than it is today in the early solar system. So the activity, because also young stars are more active, might counterbalance this smaller brightness. Okay, so flares, bacteria, and UV. So there are extremophiles. There are bacteria which are extremely resistant to temperature, high temperature, low temperature, high pressure, low pressure, salinity, pH, acidity, that's pH, and radiation, okay? And like Deinococcus hydrodurans is one of these extremophile. And oceans and thick atmosphere might attenuate the effect of the flares or the UV and X-ray radiation from the flares. But the problem is that how do we estimate the impact of like a cumulative effect of many flares? And also the genetic adaptation. How do the mechanism of DNA repair evolve with these organisms? So the sun, when it was young, produced super flares. And again, for the initial, it's both both positive and negative effects. For the start of life, which started around 700 million years, when the Earth was, and the solar system was 700 million years old, there were chemical alterations in the chemical composition of the atmosphere, which might have produced greenhouse effect, because the sun was cooler, like the sun was 25% less bright. So this might, as I already said, might counterbalance this. But of course, there are negative effects, which are the high doses of UV radiation. And these, she talked about a couple of weeks ago. She talked about her work, but she didn't mention these, so I'll just mention very briefly these results. These were 2 papers from Raissa's PhD thesis about the biological impact of super flares in planets in the habitable zone. So I think I already talked about this. So what was there are 2 papers. One of them investigated what would be the impact of a hypothetical planet on the habitable zone of Kepler-96, which is a solar-like star, and the 3 planets in the habitable zone of TRAPPIST-1. And here is what we designed for the investigation. So we detect a flare or a super flare in the visible using Kepler data. We estimate how much UV radiation was produced by this spectrum. This was in the visible. And for that, we use the sun as a laboratory for Kepler 96 and AD-LEO, which has a lot of UV observation of flares for the TRAPPIST-1 system. We model the planet atmosphere using an Archean atmosphere of the Earth or the present atmosphere of the Earth with oxygen and ozone. We estimate what is the UV flux which reaches the surface, and then what is the biological impact on two bacteria. The Deinococcus hydradurans, which is an extremophile, very resistant to UV, and Escherichia coli, which is a bacteria that we all carry in our guts. And why use Kepler 96? Kepler 96 is a solar-like star with super flares, and Kepler 96 its age is estimated in 2.2 billion years. What was happening on the solar system or on Earth when Earth was 2.2 billion years? We had the great oxygenation event when the cyanobacteria, which were living in the oceans, started to do photosynthesis, and then that's when they produced a lot of oxygen, and when we had the first increase in oxygen in our atmosphere. And here are the flares of Kepler 96 on the transits of Kepler 96b, which is not a habitable planet, okay? It is very close into the star. And here are the energy of the flares. Remember, the sun at most 10 to the 32 ergs. So this one is 10 to the 35. These are all super flares. And here is the Archean composition of Earth atmosphere. So the nitrogen component is the same, 80%, but here, presently, we have about 20% of oxygen, but about 2 billion years ago, it was 20% of carbon dioxide. Here's the sun, only 75% of its actual brightness. And so here is a flux in the ultraviolet, the spectrum. So here is of the atmosphere of the star, and here's when it produces a flare. So you can see the increase in the UV flux. And here is the atmosphere and how much it absorbs. This is a present day atmosphere with ozone, which is the ozone layer, which is absorbing all this ultraviolet flux. And then an Archean atmosphere, which lets all this flux, doesn't absorb it, and let it all reach the surface. And in order to calculate the impact on the bacteria, this is the dose for 10% survival, which means that if the flux, for instance, for Escherichia coli, is larger than 22.5 joules per meter, what will happen is 90% of the bacteria will die. Basically, will die. Okay, and for Deinococcus radiodurans, it's 553. So what we see here is that we can only have for the Archean atmosphere, everybody would die. It's an only, but if it has ozone, then everybody's fine. When it has a orange rectangle, that means survival. When there is no rectangle, it means it's sterilized. But we know we're here, okay? So life survived on Earth past the 2 billion years super flares if the sun was like Kepler 96. Okay, then what we do is, let's say then that the life was in an ocean or in a lake. And so the water of the ocean or the lake would absorb all this extra ultraviolet light from the flares. And we do that, we calculate for Kepler 96 and for and here are the results. And what we see is that for Escherichia coli, we just needed 28 meters of water of depth. So it can be a lake, doesn't need to be an ocean, a deep ocean. But for Deinococcus radiodurans, 12 meters is fine. Remember, Deinococcus is much more resistant to UV radiation. So if all the living organisms on Earth, 2 billion years, if 2 billion years ago, if the sun produced the same superflares as Kepler-96, if there was any life on the surface of the planet, it would be extinct. But if it's underwater, then everything's fine. We did the same thing, just because I want to get to the last part, I'll just run a little bit here. We did the same thing for TRAPPIST-1. This is the star, and this is relative size to Jupiter. And 39 light years from Earth, 12 parsec. It's an ultra-cold star, 2500 Kelvin. See, it's less than 10% the mass of the sun, and here is its radius. And here are the planets. It's the red dwarfs on its 7 planets. And there are 3 planets, E, F, and G, which are in the habitable zone, in this green zone. So these are terrestrial planets. They're all about the all 7 are about the size of the Earth. And these ones, if there is water on the planet, it might be in a liquid form on the surface. And just for you, you probably can't see it, but like all the TRAPPIST-1 system would fit in this small, let me move this, would fit in this small radius here. And this is Mercury, so you can see that it's very compact system. So it's very close to the star. And well, here are the 7 planets orbit with it. TRAPPIST is a telescope on the ground where they discovered, I guess, the first 2 planets, and then they use Spitzer observations in the infrared to get the other planets. So here are the orbits, here are the transits. But TRAPPIST-1, the star, is a red dwarf, and it's very active. So here's one of the flares from TRAPPIST-1. So in about a month of observation, because this was observed with K2, there were a total of 47 flares. So it's very active. And so what we did is we calculated, again, the same thing, but here we used a more sophisticated cold John 4. And so here's the same thing. So here at the and there are many curves because there are different times during the flare. And so here is the stellar flux, here up here. And then here is an atmosphere, a modern atmosphere with oxygen. And here is the Archean atmosphere. And so here are the results. If there is ozone, everybody's fine with all the flares and all the 3 planets. But if it's an Archean atmosphere, then no. I mean, there's only survivor for Deinococcus radiodurans for the further, there are 3 planets, the 2 planets which are further away. But if we do the same thing with the water, with an ocean, 10 meters of depth would be fine for these 2 bacteria to survive. And now, changing a little bit subject for the last bit. How do we know about the atmospheric composition of exoplanets? One way to detect the composition of exoplanet, and Raissa talked about this on her talk, is to do transmission spectroscopy. So what it is, you look at the planet during a transit, a different wavelength, so you use a spectrograph, and you can see that here is the optical, and then here are 2 other wavelengths. And what you see is because the light of the star goes through the atmosphere of the planet, and then you can detect what is the abundance of the elemental at that wavelength, because we have different depth. So basically what you do is you measure the transit depth, you put it in a spectra, and you try and detect lines. For instance, like this one, Raissa showed this. This is from JG 1132b. And what we see here, so this is transit depth. So when the depth is here, when the depth is smaller, that means then that the atmosphere, you have more abundant element. In this case, the hydrogen cyanide, and which is a substance which comes from volcanism. So the interpretation, result for this was that this atmosphere of this planet is a secondary atmosphere, just like Earth, because primary atmospheres are hydrogen and helium. So it has already lost its hydrogen and helium atmosphere, and volcanism has composed a secondary atmosphere, and the hydrogen cyanide here in this peak is what is it was prominent. And then here to show that there's some kind of haze which causes this inclination here. And look at this image. This is a real image. Okay, this is Titan. Okay, this is a haze from Titan. See, this is NASA. This is not AI. This is NASA, and you can see even Saturn there. So this is a haze, methane from Titan. Okay, but you can see that you can induce the radiation from the star can induce chemical reactions in the atmosphere and can cause hazes like this in Titan. And of course, this hazes will also protect the planet from the ultraviolet radiation. But it will also affect biosignatures. And I think Raíssa showed this. This is work from a paper that's submitted from Victor Sumida, who is doing a BEPI from FAPESP with Raíssa. He's a PhD student of mine, which is there at JPL with her. And what you can see is that these are the different molecules, CO2, methane, water, and you can see that you have Rayleigh scattering from haze, from particles which are suspended in the atmosphere, and it will completely obliterate the signal from these molecules. So you can't really say what's in the atmosphere if it has this haze. And the haze is produced by, for instance, from TOI 700D, from methane and SO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, now I couldn't end this talk without talking about K218b. For those of you who haven't heard about it, it was in the news last week, and it's called the Haitian world. What is a Haitian world? It's a planet. Oh, that's AI, by the way. Okay, it's a planet completely covered. This is a sub-Neptune planet. Okay, and you can see that it has a mass which is 8 times the mass of Earth and 2.6 times the radius of the Earth. It's in a close orbit, 33 days, but it's in the habitable zone because its star K218 is a red dwarf with only about a third the mass of the sun. And what is a Haitian world? Is a world completely covered by ocean, no continents, okay, just water. Oh, of course there is rock inside, but it's ocean. We don't know its depth, but it's completely covered by ocean, the whole surface of the planet. And then on top of it, there is a hydrogen-rich, thick atmosphere. That's what makes it a sub-Neptune. So you have a thick H2 atmosphere with an ocean and then the rocky planet. So no surface. And this planet has already studied in 2023. There was a paper where they claim the authors have detected methane and CO2, which might be potential biosignatures for life. But methane and CO2 are very abundant in the solar system and in the universe and the galaxy, and doesn't necessarily have to be produced by life. But then last week, Madhusudham et al. From Cambridge University, they published this paper in APJ Letters, New Constraints on DMS and DMDS in the Atmosphere of K218b from James Webb MIRI instrument. So, and they claim that this planet is a Haitian planet with, I already talked about global oceans with a rich atmosphere H2. And, well, first of all, what are these DMS and DMS? These are dimethyl sulfide and disulfide of dimethyl disulfide. Tá? Sulfeto de dimetila e disulfeto de metila. And the thing about this is that these two gases here on Earth are caused by life, by life in the ocean, And so that was the big thing, that they claim to have detected these two gases on the atmosphere of an exoplanet. And so far, we don't know how these gases could be produced without being from a life form. And anyway, these are pioneer observations of a small planet. Well, sub-Neptunes are considered small planets compared to giant Jupiter-like planets. And in the infrared. Okay, so this was with MIRI of James. It's in the infrared from 6 to 12 micron. And they claim to have detected the lines from these two gases, which with an abundance of 10 ppm per volume, and with a 3 sigma. Well, let me show it here. So the observations were done with MIRI from JW with low resolution, and they reduced the data using two different pipelines, independent pipelines, to be sure that they were detecting the peaks. They use atmospheric retrieval, considering 20 molecules for a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, and then they used a multi-nest, nested sampling, to match the observations to the retrieval atmospheric model to get this. This is the data. The data are these red crosses, being to a very low resolution. And what they're claiming is that they have a 3 sigma peak here of the sulfeto de dimetila and disulfeto de metila. And here, not here, but here and here. So that's their claim, that they have detected in the mid-infrared these two gases with a 3 sigma signal. Okay. And this blue line here, that's the model, the best model that was fit to the data, which included these molecules. They included 20 molecules, and these two were 2 of them. Oh, and here's just another plot from the paper also showing this is the retrieval model of the atmospheric retrieval model. And you can see that it has methane, CO2, DMS, DMDS. And you can see here, for instance, that the CO2 in the mid-infrared has basically no signature. And the methane has a little bit, but the main signal would come from these two biosignature gases. And then you have here the proportion. So here are the conclusions of the paper. So they claim evidence of biosignature for these two gases with a 3 sigma signal to noise. The origin is probably biological, because they claim it's hard to explain the existence of these gases if not from bacteria and or phytoplankton in the case of Earth, which is, on Earth, those two gases are produced by phytoplankton, which is then marine life forms. And one important thing is that if we consider the abundance of these gases on the atmosphere of K218b, it's about 20 times the level of Earth. So it's not only that there is life, but that the planet is teeming with these oceanic life forms producing these two gases. And of course, they also claim that this just adds to their already detection of methane and CO2. And of course, then here is all again from the paper, need more observations, more modeling, and of course involving the whole community to come up, with more models, more observations, more theories, and more experiments, on lab experiments. Now, just like Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So, is this really, did they really stumble upon the first evidence of life on an exoplanet? Of course, the whole exoplanet community, the atmospheric community, they're discussing a lot about this. And of course, they're talking about the data reduction, because it was bent, in order to get a 3 sigma signal for the peaks, the data was bent to very low resolution. So is that acceptable? Can the authors do that? Is really a Haitian world the best model for K2-18b? I already saw a paper which says that just the normal sub-Neptune, like with a gaseous atmosphere, would also fit the observation. So you don't really need it to be a Haitian world. This was something that their group, Matt Hutton, created. He's the one first to propose this kind of model, he and his group. And these peaks are really from these gases? And if they are from these gases, are there no other gases which would produce? And this is apparently where their models are okay. But remember, this is from retrieval models. You model it and you fit to the data. So, and not only that, but are these 2 gases, is there a way, if the peaks are from these 2 gases, is there a way to produce these gases from an abiotic method, like chemistry? I mean, it's a different world, like we don't have anything similar here in the solar system. Maybe there is some chemical reaction that we don't know that might produce them. So, and of course, caution is needed, right? Cautela e canja de galinha nunca fizeram mal a ninguém. So that's where it is right now. And of course, there's a lot of people trying to disclaim these results and trying to analyze the data independently. But one thing is for sure, and the authors also say that, we need more time, more observations, because if it's true, then the signal will increase. If otherwise, if it's not true, it will go away. Not only that, but also looking for other possible Haitian worlds which would also have the same biosignature. But nevertheless, it is, I think it is a great result. And one thing is, okay, the data is great, it's extraordinary. The interpretation we can discuss, right? But like just the fact that we're looking in the mid-infrared at the atmosphere of a distant world, I think this is fascinating. And okay, so I think I've talked enough. I'll leave you with my conclusions, and thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Very timely seminar, giving these new discoveries. Betty.
Pri, very nice talk. Really, you made a very nice overview of everything. Going to this last subject that is somehow connected also with Raisa, this sub-Newtonian. This is just one discovery, right? This Haitian sub-Newtonian potential planet, exoplanet. But how many sub-Newtonian examples do we have currently observed, and closer than this one?
Oh, this is not that far away. It's like 124 light years.
Right. So but do you have an idea of how many closer than it? Because probably now they are looking at exactly the same kind of, because it's a proxy for, looking for these guys. If this
I don't have a number for you, Betty, but I know that sub-Neptunes are the most abundant planets in the galaxy. So they're in the thousands, probably. There's probably about, let's say, 1,000 sub-Neptunes. Of course, not all of them are in the habitable zone. For you to have a liquid ocean, you need to be in the habitable zone.
Okay.
But I think there are.
So
there are
they will soon,
other examples.
They might soon discover other
Yes.
counterparts like this,
I'm
right?
sure the group already has proposals for James Webb for observing other planets.
To at least to get similar patterns, right? Sorry, I can get it later. But then you mentioned that at least one of those papers, they refute this hypothesis because that the spectra could be the spectrum actually could be reproduced by other. Yes, these these lines could be reproduced by other potential species or something more conventional to what is expected in sub-Newtonian.
Yeah, that's the thing. In the mid-infrared, there are not that many other signatures. So I think this is one of the strongest factors here.
Claims from these people. Okay, so we have to wait a bit.
Because I know the papers, of course I talked to Heis about this, and what I'm saying is what she told me. But what she said is that they did a thorough, I mean, I read the paper, but they did a thorough job at looking at all the possible species which would have lines in the mid-infrared here on this wavelength. Oh, and one thing that I haven't talked about, because that's what I want to work with, and I'm going to propose maybe to André or to Victor, is transmission spectra measures transit depth. I've talked a lot about occulted spots from transits. So here, and they do mention that on the paper, they have not done any analysis of possible spots on the transit. Because a spot, remember, it also causes a bump. It also changes the depth of the transit. So that was one thing, like could star spot cause
these false
some of these features, these features here, which they're interpreting as lines.
Right.
Could it be the result of star spots?
Feature.
The spectrum is not simultaneous.
Yes.
Why spots keep falling?
Because
they cause the spikes as well. And in the same band, right?
I'll get there. Here. Oops.
Exactly.
See? These are what spots cause. And if you have many spots, then your transit will be shallower. And what you're measuring in transmission spectrum is a transit depth. So you might be thinking that you're measuring a real transit depth due to the passage of a planet with an atmosphere, but you have a spot on the surface of the star which is affecting the transit depth. So I mean, it's, you think the star is clean, no spots, and so what you're measuring is the actual transit depth, which is mainly from the planet atmosphere, but it's not.
And the star is a red dwarf?
Red dwarf,
oh, right.
0.36.
So giant flares.
So.
Okay, very interesting.
More questions?
George?
So about the WASP 12B, could it be photo evaporation or is really a bow shop?
No, sorry. It's before this, right? Here, right?
Yes, because they have this asymmetry.
It looks like the other plot that I showed you, the diagram. Yeah, I mean they model it as a bow shock, but yeah, I guess it could also be because it's also from the transit does look like photo evaporation. You're right.
And the AI image of stellar spots looks funny because it doesn't have a limb darkening, But the opposite, it looks like a limb brightening.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Yeah. But okay, so let's, oh, I don't have any. My model has limb darkening, okay? Just so that it's very clear. The eclipse model has, I do include limb darkening. But yeah, I mean, that AI will do anything, right?
More questions?
Oh, here. No.
Sorry?
Oh, I do have a picture from the model. Here, see? That's the model, limb darkening. And you can do linear limb darkening, quadratic, even the 4-parameter one. You can choose your limb darkening law.
I just want to complement the previous answer, because the spot here, the contamination that you see here, it's also dependent on the wavelength that you are observing. So that's why you could see bumps in specific wavelengths and not in others, and mimic the spectral feature. And also the refutal of the hypothesis of the Haitian worm was for previous observation using the NIRSPEC and other instrument from James Webb, not specifically the SMIRI. The SMIRI is more in the mid-infrared, and the previous observations were more the near infrared. So.
Thank you, Andre.
Okay, let's thank Adriana again.
Thank you.
There's a coffee break outside.
Betty, onde você pegou esse bug? Mas eu